What's the one event that defines a nation? It's a simple question, but the answer is anything but. For a country as huge and complex as Australia, a land with a human story stretching back more than 65,000 years, picking just one moment seems impossible. Is it the political act that creates the state, the bloody battle that forges its character, or the existential crisis that forces it to choose survival over sentiment? This isn't just a history lesson. This is a search for the pivotal point in time that shaped Australia's identity more than any other. Many people would point to 1901, the year the Commonwealth was born and a new nation was created from a collection of colonies. It was a massive political achievement, celebrated with parades and grand pronouncements of a unified destiny. Others might say it was Gallipoli, where the ANZAC legend, as the story goes, forged the nation's soul in the fires of war, a story of sacrifice and matchup against impossible odds. But what if the most pivotal moment in Australian history wasn't a beginning, but an end? A moment of shock and terror that forced Australia to abandon its past and choose a new path, just to survive. Join me as we explore the events that shaped a continent, to find the one single moment that stands as Australia's biggest in history. Before we can even talk about Australia, we have to define what Australia is. For that, we need to go back to the late 19th century. Picture a continent that isn't one country, but 6 separate, self-governing British colonies: New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania. There were practically 6 different countries. Each had its own government, laws, defense force, even its own postage stamps and railway gauges. Imagine the chaos. A train trip from Melbourne to Sydney, something that should be simple, was held up at the border in Albury, while customs officials dug through passengers' luggage for taxed goods. This wasn't just an annoyance, it was a symbol of a divided continent. For decades, the idea of uniting these colonies had been kicked around, but it was always bogged down by petty rivalries. So what changed? As one of the key figures in the movement, Sir Robert Garran put it, the colonies were ultimately united by a powerful mix of fear, national sentiment, and by the 1880s and 90s, the arguments for unity were getting harder to ignore. Business leaders were fed up with the web of tariffs strangling trade between colonies. A single economic market, they argued, would make everyone stronger. Then there was defense. The huge, sparsely populated continent felt vulnerable, and a single national defense force seemed a lot smarter than 6 tiny armies. Immigration was another big issue, with many wanting a single, national policy. But maybe the biggest driver was a new sense of identity. By the end of the 19th century, most people living in the colonies had been born there. They didn't see themselves as just transplanted Britons anymore. They were Australians, and a sense of shared national pride was growing. The man often called the father of federation, Sir Henry Parkes, the Premier of New South Wales, tapped into this feeling. On October 24, 1889, in the border town of Tenterfield, he gave a speech that changed everything. He spoke directly to the public, not just to other politicians, asking, "The great question which we have to consider is whether the time has not now arisen for the creation on this Australian continent of an Australian government and an Australian parliament. Surely what the Americans have done by war, Australians can bring about in peace." That speech was the spark. A series of conventions were held through the 1890s, where delegates from each colony hammered out a new constitution. It was a massive job of negotiation and compromise, and the final draft had to be approved by the people in a series of referendums. Finally, the day arrived. On January 1, 1901, in Centennial Park, Sydney, the Commonwealth of Australia was proclaimed. Up to 500,000 people lined the streets for a massive parade, celebrating the birth of their new nation under the banner "One People, One Destiny." The 6 colonies became states, handing over powers like defense, customs, and immigration to a new federal government. The first federal parliament opened on May 9, 1901, with Edmund Barton as Australia's first Prime Minister. The case for federation being Australia's biggest moment is simple. It's the nation's origin story. It was the moment the legal and political entity of Australia was officially created. It built the framework for the modern nation, and its constitution still stands today. Without it, there's no Commonwealth of Australia to even talk about. It was the foundational act, achieved not with war, but with debate, democracy, and a shared vision. But can a political agreement truly define a people? Does signing a document, no matter how important, really capture the heart of a nation? Or is a country's true identity forged not in a park, but in a place of fire and sacrifice? Just 14 years after its peaceful birth, the new nation of Australia was pulled into a global conflict, the First World War. As a part of the British Empire, Australia's involvement was never in doubt. When Britain declared war on Germany in 1914, Australia was in, but no one could have predicted how a disastrous military campaign on a remote Turkish peninsula would become so deeply burned into the nation's soul. The British plan was to seize the Dardanelles Strait, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and open a supply line to Russia. On April 25, 1915, as part of this plan, The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, the ANZAC, landed on the shores of the Gallipoli Peninsula. For the vast majority of the 16,000 men who scrambled ashore that day, it was their first time in combat. Objectively, it was a catastrophe. The landings were a mess, often in the wrong places, and the ANZACs were met with fierce resistance from Turkish forces defending their homeland. The campaign bogged down into a brutal 8-month stalemate. The soldiers endured unimaginable hardship, blistering heat, freezing winters, rampant disease, constant shelling, and the sheer terror of trench warfare. When the Allies finally evacuated in December 1915, it was an undeniable defeat. The cost was staggering. Over 8,700 Australians were killed, and more than 17,000 were wounded. So, why would a bloody, failed military campaign, one that made up only a fraction of Australia's total losses in the war, become a contender for the nation's biggest moment? Because the story of Gallipoli quickly became something more than the grim reality of the battle. As news of the fighting came home, the focus wasn't on the failure, but on the character of the soldiers. The war correspondent Charles Bean was key to creating this story. In his dispatches, he painted the Australian soldier as a new kind of man, different from his British commanders. The ANZAC, as he was described, was resourceful, cynical, unafraid of danger, and incredibly loyal to his mates. The qualities seen on those cliffs and in those trenches: endurance, and above all, Machipua, held up as the defining traits of the Australian spirit. This was the birth of the ANZAC legend. It was a powerful, romantic idea that suggested that on the shores of Gallipoli, Australia had been baptized in fire and had come out with a soul of its own. It was no longer just Britain's junior partner. It was a nation whose identity had been forged through shared sacrifice. The impact on Australia's identity was profound. April 25th was named ANZAC Day and was first marked in 1916. It quickly became Australia's most sacred national day. The ANZAC legend became a cornerstone of Australian culture, a kind of secular religion that gave the young nation a story of heroism that was far more emotional than the political deal-making of federation. The argument for Gallipoli is that it was the moment of Australia's cultural birth. If federation created a nation's body, Gallipoli is said to have forged its soul. It defined what it meant to be Australian, creating a national identity based on ideals of courage and camaraderie that we still celebrate. But is a nation's identity really born from tragedy on a foreign shore? Or is the most defining moment the one that hits closer to home, one that threatens the nation's very existence and forces a choice that will set its course for the next century? For its first 40 years, Australia lived under one core belief: its security was guaranteed by the mighty British Empire. The Singapore strategy was the bedrock of this belief. Australia poured money and faith into the idea that a massive British naval base in Singapore would be an unbreakable fortress, a shield against any attack from the north. When the Second World War broke out, Australia once again sent its troops to fight for Britain in Europe and North Africa, trusting that the shield would hold. In early 1942, that shield was shattered. On February 15, 1942, the impregnable fortress of Singapore fell to the Imperial Japanese Army. It was a stunning disaster for the British Empire. Over 130,000 Allied troops, including more than 15,000 Australians, were captured. For Australia, it was a moment of pure shock. The strategic foundation the nation had relied on for generations had turned to dust. The fall of Singapore wasn't just a distant defeat. It felt like a betrayal. The threat was no longer just a theory. 4 days later, on February 19, 1942, the war came to Australia. In 2 separate raids, 242 Japanese aircraft, many from the same fleet that attacked Pearl Harbor, bombed the northern city of Darwin. The port, the airfields, and the town were devastated. At least 235 people were killed. Ships were sunk in the harbor, planes were destroyed on the ground, and more than half the civilians fled. This wasn't the start of an invasion. But for the Australian people, the psychological impact was enormous. The continent was no longer a safe haven. The war was here. This perfect storm to fall of the British shield in a direct attack on home soil created an existential crisis. Australia was exposed, vulnerable, and for the first time, truly alone. And it was in this moment of crisis that Prime Minister John Curtin made a decision that would redefine the nation's future. In a New Year's message published on December 27, 1941, even before Singapore had fallen, Curtin had signaled a huge shift. In words that sent shockwaves through London, he declared, without any inhibitions of any kind, "I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom." This was revolutionary. For 150 years, Australia had been tied to Britain. Now, its leader was saying that, for survival, that bond was no longer enough. He was pivoting the nation's strategic allegiance from the old empire to the new rising power in the Pacific, the United States. And this wasn't just talk. Curtin fought fiercely with Winston Churchill to bring Australian troops home from the Middle East to defend their own country. He welcomed American General Douglas MacArthur to Australia, making the country the main Allied base for the war in the Southwest Pacific. This great pivot of 1942 was a pragmatic, desperate, and ultimately nation-defining act. It was the moment Australia was forced to grow up. The comfortable dependence on Britain was over, replaced by a new, more realistic partnership with America that remains the bedrock of Australian foreign policy to this day. The argument for 1942 is that it was the moment of truth. It wasn't about creating a political body or forging a myth. It was about survival. The fall of Singapore and the bombing of Darwin destroyed the colonial-era illusions that had defined Australia's place in the world. The pivot to America was a conscious choice to break from the past to secure a future. It was the moment that shaped the geopolitical reality of modern Australia. So, there they are, our three contenders. Federation in 1901, the political birth of the nation, a peaceful and deliberate creation. Gallipoli in 1915, the bloody baptism, a military failure that became a cultural myth, defining the Australian character. And the great pivot of 1942, the existential crisis, when the fall of Singapore and the bombing of Darwin forced a pragmatic break from the British past and forged a new alliance with America for survival. Each moment is profound. Each has a legitimate claim. Federation created Australia's body. Gallipoli, so the legend goes, forged its spirit. But a body and a spirit aren't much use if you can't survive. While Federation was essential and Gallipoli provided a powerful identity, it is the crisis of 1942 that stands as Australia's biggest, most defining moment. Here's why. The events of 1942 weren't about myths or aspirations. They were about cold, hard reality. The fall of Singapore was an undeniable failure of the imperial defense system Australia had trusted its whole life. The bombing of Darwin brought the war home in a way that Gallipoli, for all its horror, never did. This wasn't a battle fought by choice in a distant land. This was an attack on the Australian mainland. These twin shocks forced Australia to confront a brutal truth. When everything was on the line, the old loyalties weren't enough. Survival required a cold, pragmatic choice. John Curtin's pivot to America wasn't just a change in foreign policy. It was a psychological and strategic declaration of independence. It was the moment Australia stopped being a junior partner in the British Empire and started acting like a sovereign nation looking after its own destiny. The legacies of Federation and Gallipoli are huge, but they are mostly internal. Federation shaped Australia's government, Gallipoli shaped itself. But the legacy of 1942 is both internal and external. It permanently changed Australia's relationship with the world, setting the strategic course that defines it to this day. The ANZAC Treaty, the close military cooperation with the United States, it all has its roots in that desperate pivot. It was the moment that ensured there would be a modern, secure Australia to even debate its own history. It was the biggest moment because it was about everything. It was the end of Australia's colonial adolescence and the beginning of its modern adulthood. Of course, this is a debate with no single right answer. A powerful case can be made for the 1967 referendum, where over 90% of Australians voted to finally count Indigenous Australians as part of the huge step on a long and unfinished journey. For many, that moment of national reckoning is the most significant of all. The story of a nation is never just one story. It's a collection of moments of triumphs, tragedies, and transformations. The political founding in 1901, the spiritual forging at Gallipoli in 1915, and the pragmatic pivot in 1942 are all critical chapters. But for its lasting impact on Australia's survival and its place in the modern world, 1942 stands just that little bit taller. It was the moment that didn't just shape Australia, it saved it. But that's just my take. What do you think was the biggest moment in Australian history? Was it Federation, Gallipoli, the fall of Singapore, the 1967 referendum, or something else entirely? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories that shaped our world.